Welcome to this episode of Flourishing Leadership. I'm your host, Guy Rogers, and our mission here is to help you unleash the full potential of your leadership calling. You can find out more about Flourishing Leadership at flourishing-leadership.com. My guest today is Chris McCluskey. Chris is president of Professional Christian Coaching Institute, PCCI, the world's largest Christian school accredited by the International Coaching Federation. PCCI has trained thousands of life and leadership coaches in more than 90 countries and in many of the world's most influential ministries and businesses. Frequently cited as the father of Christian coaching, Chris pioneered the industry in the 1990s and co-hosts the top-rated podcast, Professional Christian Coaching Today. He is a popular keynote speaker, thought leader, media personality, and executive coach. He and his wife, Rachel, are best-selling authors of the marriage classic, When Two Become One, and are blessed with 7 children, a wonderful son-in-law and daughter-in-law, and 3 of the cutest grandchildren you've ever seen. And on a personal note, in late 2018, after Chris had been on my Pinnacle Forum podcast, and I'd been on his, he encouraged me to investigate leadership coaching. I did, enrolled in his program, and today have a thriving leadership coaching practice that I'm privileged to say has very positively impacted dozens of leaders. So thanks, Chris, for that, and thanks for taking the time to join us on the podcast today.
No, absolutely. Wouldn't miss this, and thank you for the invitation. It's great to be back together again, Guy.
Indeed it is, indeed. So yours really is a remarkable story of not only leadership, but entrepreneurial innovation. And we're going to dig into this a little more in the podcast. So I want to start with unpacking for our listeners how you made a major career change back in the 90s and how that produced what PCCI is today.
All right. I'll give the Reader's Digest version of that. I was running a very large and successful Christian counseling practice in Tampa Bay, Florida. We were stationed in Clearwater on that side of the bay, but we were the largest distinctly Christian practice on either side of the bay. So I had a team of therapists and interns. I was seeing clients as well and loving that, absolutely loving that. And Rachel, my wife, and I had the first 2 of our children and then our 3rd child. And that looked like that was going to kind of be the trajectory for the next, 20 years of our lives or so. Of course, you don't invest that much in education and supervision and licensure and building something like that and just figure that it's going to be tossed on the wind.
Right.
But that's kind of what happened.
That's what happened.
Well, it wasn't tossed to the wind, but what began to happen for us is something that is a core of what you, Guy, know and anybody else listening who is familiar with coaching is all about. And that is we became clearer and clearer about elements of vision that were not what we would desire them to be. And that was on the personal front for the most part. The business was looking great. But with the advent of children, it's only when you become a parent that you begin to realize, wow, this changes everything.
Oh, yeah.
And my own employer, I was an entrepreneur. The reality of running a practice like that was it still functioned like a job. I went off to work in the morning before the kids were really up, maybe one's, waving bye-bye at the window, sleepy-eyed. And I came home at 5 or 6 o'clock at night, and hopefully dinner was, still hot and I wasn't too late. Thursday nights was always therapy group night, so I was late Thursday nights. Weekends were generally mine. Saturday morning, I'd often go in and do the books, that kind of thing. But it looked like something that I grew up with my own father as an employee going off to the steel mill, and then he'd come back home. And what Rachel and I began to talk about with regard to our parenting was we were experimenting with homeschooling.
Okay.
And Rachel, having been an educator herself, she was a teacher for several years before we started having kids. She was saying, goodness, the whole world could become our classroom, except you're still kind of tied to that job. So if you're not in the chair, you're not making money. And I'm like, yeah, and I'm not really digging on that. So we dared to start asking questions. And that's the core of coaching, right?
That's exactly right.
What's possible? What could be here? And that's what put everything on the very different trajectory. Long story short, we began to feel very strongly that we wanted me to be able to have a job that I could work from home. And ideally, then we would not live in a densely populated area like Tampa Bay. We loved the area and had lots of friends and all, but we wanted the country. And I mean country. So, Guy, I live on a dirt road
Yep.
There aren't too many of those left in the U.S., but I live on a dirt road in south central Missouri. This is the farm that my mother grew up on when she was a little girl.
Wow.
Sold out of the family for about 40 years, came back into the family through what we believe is very much the hand of God. And so we have lived here now 25 years on this farm. I have worked from this, and when I say farm, it's 440 acres. It's a big stretch of
Wow.
quiet
Yeah.
country, woods and cattle. And no, I don't run cattle, and I don't know the first thing about real farming, but we lease the land out for those who do. So very different life from running a counseling practice in Clearwater, Florida. And of course, kids kept coming. So here we are now with those 7 that you mentioned. And yeah, the rest has been a very different story, I think, than what our story would have otherwise been.
Mm-hmm. For sure. So what I find most intriguing about that is the role that risk-taking plays in leadership. How often, and I'm sure you have encountered this, that we meet people who you can see potential, but they're too afraid of the risk.
Oh, yeah.
And so they hunker down in a comfort bubble and they miss out the things that God could be doing if they, in either an entrepreneurial fashion or any other fashion, took a risk and moved out. And I see my coaching clients doing more of that because they have a coach who works with them, who helps them explore that.
Yes.
You see it, far more than I have, I'm sure. So this, I know, is going to be a tough question because it can kind of narrow down to one thing. But what would you say then is the most important lesson you learned about the relationship between risk-taking and leadership?
Yeah, I think you actually used the phrase, and I'll just borrow it. You talked about hunkering down into a comfort place, and I would say, or an uncomfortable place. It's at least a familiar place, and that land of familiar is so potentially dangerous to all of us. I had a very familiar and comfortable life there. There was nothing that we didn't like in Florida, and I didn't know about the field of coaching initially. I just dared to sit with the questions of what if and what might it be like for me to work from home. I certainly wasn't going to bring my therapy clients into my home. So what could that look like? And the Lord then, I believe, brought to my awareness this people helping profession called coaching that is so similar to some of what I was doing in therapy, but that was all about healing. This was about growth. This was about vision. This was about proactive moving forward into something different. And so the issue of risk then is kind of a two-sided coin there. There is risk in anything that we begin to dare to step out in. Something new, something possible, something that could blow up in our faces, but it's at least calling to us. There is, I believe, just as much risk in staying put in that land of familiar, in the areas where we think we're comfortable at least, and God is saying, "Ooh, I'm going to do a new thing. Will you not perceive it?" And we don't perceive it, or we perceive it and we turn away because we're scared. The risks are on either side. And that, I think, is an important leadership concept, that the risk sometimes is not what could happen if you do this, but what could happen if you don't.
You know, that reminds me of something Dallas Willard wrote in his book, The Great Omission. He refers to Bonhoeffer's book, The Cost of Discipleship. And he says, yes, there is a cost of discipleship, but then he poses the question, what is the cost of not having discipleship?
Yeah.
So that's what you're referencing. There's a risk to step out, but there is also risk to stay put. And oftentimes, what do we look at? Just the one side of the coin of risk and not the other. You know, when you really encouraged me, and I remember clearly that fall of 2018 to look at being trained to be a leadership coach. As you know, I was going through a very, very difficult personal time in my life.
Yeah.
And I had to weigh where I was emotionally and the constraints and responsibilities of being the president of Pinnacle Forum. And I don't know if you know, you probably don't know this, as a matter of fact. So 3 weeks into the first course, I almost quit.
Oh, wow. No,
and there were 2 reasons. The first was the emotional pressures I was going through were so enormous, I didn't think I could handle it. And I, at risk of sounding like I'm tooting my own horn here, but I have quite a bit of capacity to deal with things. I was at excess capacity. I was like, I can't do this. The other thing that happened was it was such a paradigm shift for me in the first 3 or 4 weeks because I've done consulting for years and problem solving. And I was a strategic consultant, and this was a paradigm shift, and I was struggling with that. So those 2 things together, but I stuck it out, and I'm glad I did. I didn't give up on it, and I'd taken that risk. And okay, I'm going to plunge through this. So, a word to the listeners: you may find yourself in the exact same place, that it seems like the worst time to actually venture into something, but it may be the best time. It may be the best
Again,
time.
that issue of risk, whether you do or you don't. And so you stop
Yep.
and be with the questions so that you can discern. Is the Lord calling you to some kind of a new season? Will you perceive it? And in perceiving it, will you dare then to step out into it?
Right, right. So you mentioned something along this line of entrepreneurialism and leadership before we went on air about this big project that you have. Think You Better, you called it. You're going to have to explain what that means to us. But I want to delve into that, because even if someone has a job, that doesn't mean you can't be entrepreneurial.
That's right.
Entrepreneurial is, I think, is sometimes viewed as, well, I got to have a full-time business that's entrepreneurial. No, you don't. There's really a spirit to being entrepreneurial. So I want you to unpack for our listeners what this Inc. You Better is. What was behind that? What are you trying to accomplish?
Okay. Well, let's plug it in here, because you, of course, introduced me as the president of Professional Christian Coaching Institute, and I am still that. So I still run the institute. That is my primary bread and butter, and that's what I've done these more than 25 years in this field. I have had a private coaching practice. I still carry a very, very tiny caseload of individual clients, but the bulk of what I do is run this very large international institute, training people in professional grade Christian coaching. But my kids that I mentioned earlier, and we transitioned out here to the farm with, they kept coming along, and kids grow up. So our oldest now is 32. By the way, we have the fourth cutest little grandchild coming along now. We learned that my daughter is pregnant. She's finishing her first trimester here. Just got to see the sonogram this week. So life has changed. Here we've got these kids now, all in their early 30s and throughout the 20s. The very youngest one, the seventh one, is 16 years old right now. So as they have gone off to their college and established themselves in various careers, every single one of them have done what you just mentioned there. Either established a side gig, they got a full-time job, and whatever the and is, they have some investment properties on the side, or they do some programming kind of contract stuff, or they do consulting or coaching. A couple of them actually have coaching practices. One designs websites full-time. A couple of them have gone full-time into their entrepreneurial ventures already. So the fostering of that has been something that in our homeschooling, once we got here on the farm, and I became more available to the family, along with my wife, in schooling the kids, noon times were always gathered around the table talking about business, just that entrepreneurial mindedness that you were referring to, thinking like an entrepreneur, recognizing that actually, listener, if you think back to a little more than 100 years ago, about the turn of the century, from the 1800s to the 1900s, the vast majority of Americans were entrepreneurs. And that doesn't mean that they weren't working jobs. It just means that back then we didn't have refrigeration and trucking and all. So we all at least grew our own food.
Correct.
And oftentimes raised our own food and slaughtered it and smoked it and whatever. There was a lot that we had to do for ourselves. And that's what entrepreneurship is. Instead of being able to show up somewhere else, do the song and dance, collect a paycheck, and somebody else is having all the headaches. Most of us, as quote farmers in some form or fashion, did that. And maybe we ran a watchmaking shop, or we were a smithy, or, a baker, or whatever else. Now, more than 90% of all Americans work jobs. We are employees, and somebody else runs and owns the businesses. But I believe that we are in an economy, and have been for more than a decade now, that is frequently described as the gig economy. It's an economy in which it's wise to not have all your eggs in the one basket of whatever that job is that you're working right now, because we know that job churn is crazy anymore.
Right.
The average person doesn't stay in a job for more than even 2 years in many cases. And so what you can wind up with is a great job that goes overseas, or gets automated, or the company closes, or you get let go, or whatever else it is that happens, and you become a career nomad. Just like a nomadic person, shepherding animals and going wherever the fields are, wherever there's green, that's where we go. We become career nomads, and there's a tremendous instability for family, for home, for any sense of community and longevity in a place. We don't have it oftentimes. Why? Because we aren't thinking like entrepreneurs. We fostered that in our kids to say, if you will think entrepreneurially and have side gigs at least, you will always have fallbacks. You'll have multiple streams of income. You can still work a full-time or part-time or three-quarter time job. But if the tides change, you are not subject to simply getting washed out to sea with them.
Sure.
You can be in a place of choice over where you want to anchor and raise your kids, and many of the things that we would love to have control over that when we're somebody else's employee, we simply don't.
Right, right. And so have you seen that the spirit of entrepreneurship, how that affects the spirit of good leadership?
Well, I think any good leader is going to have to be one who takes risks. I want to say is comfortable with risk, but I'm not sure that that's the right word. Risk, by definition, should not feel comfortable. If it does, you're probably not taking much risk. So risk is something that is critical to living, especially here in the 21st century with the dynamic pace of change. I mean, we can pick anything right now, but let's just go with AI, the big thing that we know is going to completely change the landscape. Already is beginning to, but buddy, fast forward 3 to 5 years down the road, any of us that are saying, I don't really want to take much risk in that are going to be buried under. Risk for a leader is an inherent part of effective leadership. And so having an entrepreneurial mind that always is scanning the horizon, always looking for opportunity, for what's next, for what's changing, for what could be, visionary kinds of pieces, that is the entrepreneur's mind. Any of your listeners who are familiar with Michael Gerber's book, The E-Myth, on entrepreneur, E for entrepreneur, The E-Myth, he talks about every single one of us having within us an entrepreneurial self. We have an entrepreneur self, a manager self, and a technician self. But most of us major on that technician, the doer. Most of us are very highly trained, highly educated doers. Like my dentist that did work on my teeth here this past week. Very highly educated technician. But he runs a private practice. Many dentists anymore don't.
Correct.
He's got that entrepreneurial piece of himself that saw opportunity and a managerial part that said, I can operationalize that. I can systematize that. I can take that opportunity and make it something that I could still do the work within, but I can change and grow over time. In other words, live in constant risk, constant change.
Wow. So I want to shift gears a little bit here in the last few minutes that we have. And I'm sure this is a question that you've asked yourself. You probably asked clients. I don't know, but I've heard this. It's a really good question. I've been asked it, so I've got to throw it out to you.
Okay.
There's even a song. I think Mercy Me did a song about younger me or something. I'm trying to remember but anyway, if you could look back to the younger you, say 21-year-old Chris McCluskey, okay, what would you say now to that younger you that you've learned over the years that you wish that younger you knew at age 21?
Well, I'm going to probably cheat on answering your question because I'm going to pull two things, but one of them is just a way of being. And that is, I would say to the younger you, Chris, you are not leaning into the primary calling of every Christian, which is to love. And that love is everything in the end. It's what life is all about. It's about what servant leadership is all about. Love is so important. And at 21, I think probably most of us, we're trying to find our way out in the big wide world, and that puts our attention very much on self. So we're more we don't have to be narcissistic. We're just very focused on self, and love is about focusing on others and loving their well. So in that loving spirit, then I think I would also emphasize to my younger self, I was not raised entrepreneurial at all. This way I'm talking about us having raised our kids. And I would challenge my younger self earlier to begin looking to that horizon for opportunities and seeing what could be, just living in the what's possible. What does this make possible kind of a space? Because that's where those ideas are born. And I believe that's where God oftentimes can speak to us most clearly. I frankly wasn't asking a lot of those questions. I was still wanting to just follow the map, check the boxes, get this degree, got that. All right, going to this next degree, get that one. Now what do I do? Oh, I got to work toward licensure. Okay, got it. That, where can I get hired? Here's my resume. I paid somebody to help me put it together. I was checking boxes. I wasn't living in questions.
Yeah. I have a client who recently said to me, we were having just this kind of discussion. He's in his 50s, and he said, my dad told me when I was growing up, here's how you navigate life. Get a good education, get a good job, get married, have children, and then retire.
There it
I
is.
asked him, I said, so you're in your 50s now. How does that sound to you now?
And he said,
And he said, and we can definitely help our younger selves in terms of people. I have some younger clients, they're in their 20s. What a great opportunity that is. And one in particular who asked me a lot of questions, not just me ask him questions. He comes back and says, okay, I want you to give me your insight on this. I said, okay, you realize that's a consulting hat. I'm happy to do it. But he's so curious. It's just,
very good.
I look forward to being with him. It's such a joyful time. So,
well, and see, that's what I'm saying. That's where our kids are now, that 20 something, early 30s, and the youngest one's just wrapping up the teen years. You mentioned our small business incubator here that we have called the Inc. You Better.
Yes, please.
INC for Incorporate, YOU, Inc. You, Incorporate You Better. It's a play on the word small business incubator. But we bought an old Civil War era church building, about 10,000 square feet, about 6 years ago. And our kids, my wife Rachel and I, and many of their peers are now spending time with us at the incubator, asking those questions and exploring what could be. And that's where their businesses have come from. I mean, I've got a son who is well on his way already at, what is he, 24 years old, to his first million with a business that just blows my mind. It's all based on what he grew up native with, which is internet and computers, and it's a software business. Yay. But that comes out of being raised with that mindset, living in questions, and taking a coach approach, a living in questions kind of a way of being.
Okay. So last question. Since you mentioned horizon, looking on the horizon, I think we're hiding our head in the sand if, as we look out the horizon, don't see a lot of ominous things out there. You mentioned AI. I've just read an article today about how Google has got all these kind of contracts with Defense Department, CIA, and what they're doing to combat, quote, misinformation. We know what's happening out there. We see it. We almost feel powerless to do anything about it. So speaking to the Christian leader who's listening to this podcast, what do you see for that person in terms of navigating this culture that is growing increasingly hostile to Christianity, but still being faithful to Christ, being influential for Christ in the kingdom, but the realization that we are getting into increasingly dark and challenging times?
We are very definitely. I've described it oftentimes as the next dark ages. It looks very different than what we think of as the hundreds and hundreds of years of the dark ages, but there is a kind of a dark ages upon us. And, you said, I just read an article. Hey, all leaders are readers. And no war, no battle is ever won without good intelligence. You have to understand what you're up against. And when we read and immerse ourselves in media enough to find out what we're up against, it is daunting. It's overwhelming. It can be discouraging and can even bring us to a place of despair. We mustn't do that. But we cannot afford to hide our head in that sand like you were talking about. We have to see with eyes wide open, what are we up against? And I know these sound like little trite sayings, but the only thing needed for evil to flourish is for good men to do nothing.
Correct.
We have to act, but we act with good information, and we act then with intentionality. The results, those are in the Lord's hands. But woe to us if we are not asking those questions, gathering that information, and then going ahead and acting with the light that we're given. When we do, he'll open up more light down the road. I'll close with a phrase that I keep running through my brain all the time. It's one of the many quotes that I use from C.S. Lewis. He says, a glimpse is not a vision, but to the man lost on a mountain road at night in the rain, a glimpse of the next 3 feet of path may be far more valuable than a vision of the horizon. So if we're in a dark time right now, I think we may only feel like we have glimpses of the next few feet. Like I said, light only for what's immediately in front of us. But that's enough, because that's what we need right now. We can't look up and see the horizon nearly as clearly as we'd like. And when we do, it's a scary one. It's a disturbing one. Keep our eyes focused on what the Lord's showing us just in the next few feet, as it were, and keep moving.
I like it. Chris, such a pleasure having you on. I hope our listeners have enjoyed this as much as I have, just having these conversations with you. They brighten my day. And I, again, want to thank you for that day which you said to me, have you ever thought about leadership coaching? And I said, no, I never really thought about leadership coaching. And you said, well, look at your career path. You've already done so much with respect to leadership that would seem like a next obvious step. You're right. Here we are. And thank you so much.
Well, and I am so happy for you. You've just taken what was given and the Lord has multiplied it through you, Guy, as I knew he would. I'm thrilled that your practice is not only such a blessing for you and your family, but it's blessed so many other Christian leaders. Look at this podcast as an outgrowth of it. It's very, very exciting. We see stories like this all the time inside of Professional Christian Coaching Institute, and it's one of the greatest thrills there is.
Well, thanks again for joining the podcast, Chris. It's been a pleasure.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
As a certified professional leadership coach, as I've noted here, I have the privilege of working with leaders of all ages and backgrounds, from C-level executives, nonprofit leaders, self-employed professionals, business owners, all kinds of entrepreneurs. I am passionately driven to help each of these men and women be better servant leaders every day. In this podcast, my goal is to help you do the same. That's my calling. That's my mission. If this message today speaks to you, please subscribe to this podcast by searching Flourishing Leadership with Guy Rogers on your favorite podcast app, or you can find it in YouTube, my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Flourishing Leadership. And please let your friends and colleagues know about it. Check us out at flourishing-leadership.com, where you can learn more about my leadership coaching approach and methodology and how it can help you, and where you can also find all the podcast episodes. Because today, your leadership, flourishing leadership, has never been more needed.